Well, Israeli forces ramp up operations in northern Gaza and the eastern outskirts of Rafah in hopes to target Hamas's terrorist infrastructure. Right here on the desk with us is former British Commander Colonel Richard Kemp. Richard, so great to have you here in Australia with us on the desk. You're often up there on that wall there, and we always enjoy seeing you. We loved the display of guns last time in your home, which was just stunning. That was the colonial backdrop was fantastic. James wants it for his...
for my own library.
For his own library.
I'll have it shipped over.
Thanks.
Colonel, great to see you here in Australia. So just wanted to ask, everybody wants to know, what's the end game? Can Israel defeat Hamas? And what on earth are the Americans playing at?
Before I answer that, I'd like to say it's really great to be here in Australia. I always enjoy coming here, such a wonderful country. And secondly, you mentioned the common sense of youth. I've had the pleasure of visiting many schools here in Australia since I've been here, including Kesatora here in Sydney. And I've encountered a great deal of common sense of youth, and it gives me a good deal of optimism for the future when these, particularly the Jewish children I've met, are so confident, so articulate and so knowledgeable. As far as whether Israel can defeat Hamas in Gaza, I think that's what's going to happen. We've seen the IDF fighting extremely effectively. I've been inside Gaza several times while the war's going on with the IDF, and I've seen their actions on the ground. Extremely effective. Hamas, when they come up against real soldiers as opposed to civilians in their homes, they do one of three things. They either run away, they die, or they surrender. And when they surrender, they spill the beans. So I'm optimistic and confident about Israel's success in Gaza once it really embarks on the full campaign in Rafah. As for what the US is doing, I think the US is doing two things. First of all, in trying to pressure Israel to stop fighting, an obsession with not going into Rafah and dealing with that, and therefore not finishing off Hamas. I think, firstly, they're playing to the domestic electorate, which the majority support Israel, 80%, I think, according to recent polls, but there are many who don't, and Biden wants their votes as well and is prepared to put that above the survival of Israel. And secondly, they're desperate, Biden particularly desperate to appease Iran. He doesn't want Israel to finish off Iran's major proxy in that area. And it's all part of his long-term plan to empower and give Iran more authority in the region. And it's shameful, it's disgraceful.
James.
Well, we've had some breaking news in the last couple of hours that Benny Gantz, the opposition politician, former defense minister in the war cabinet, has issued a deadline of June 8th to the Netanyahu government to say, you've got to find a way to wrap this war up. This is a huge problem for Netanyahu, but also is Benny Gantz being used by the Biden administration as a way to try and get somebody more amenable to their pro-Iran position into power in Israel if Netanyahu is so insistent on defeating Iran rather than allowing its proxies to run rampant, which seems to be what this White House is keen to do?
Yeah, I mean, the Biden White House, ever since it came into office, really, or more accurately, ever since the new Netanyahu government came into office during Biden's tenure, has been trying to bring that government down, literally. And that's bad enough in normal times, but for a very close ally to try and bring down the government of its ally, democratically elected government, during a war is absolutely disgraceful. And that's what Biden's been trying to do. And we've heard remarks from him, from Chuck Schumer, one of his close allies, and also from the Secretary of State to that effect. I don't think there's any precedent for an ally trying to bring down a democratically elected government during a war.
Well, we've seen the US be behind regime change in a number of countries, but you wouldn't expect it to be an ally.
Right.
But on Rafah, it's taken 7 months for Israel to go there. Did they take too long? Why didn't they do this earlier, especially given the plight of the hostages and where they could be held?
I don't like to second-guess a responsible democratic government and armed forces like Israel because we don't know all of the facts involved. But I think in general terms, when you fight a war, one of the most important things is speed and shock action to dislodge and to undermine the enemy and to destroy the enemy. And that's very important. But that has to be balanced also with not throwing away Israeli soldiers' lives. So you have to operate with a degree of caution. And secondly, in this particular case, we're talking about a very dense civilian population which Israel has to protect, and speed can sometimes work against that. The IDF does everything they can to minimise civilian casualties, despite the lies you hear on other elements of the international media.
Well, the UN downgraded the casualty count quite dramatically in recent days. Do we have a clear picture of what the civilian casualties are in that conflict?
The only information we have comes, and the only information the UN has, and everybody else, including the White House, comes from Hamas. And we don't know whether their figures are accurate, whether they're underplaying it, overplaying it. The likelihood is they're inflating the figures, as they have done in the past. But what we do know, I think, if we assume for a moment their figures are roughly accurate, is that the ratio of civilian casualties to military casualties is significantly lower in this war than I think any other comparable conflict that I know of. They're less than one civilian to every combatant killed, which is bad. But when you're fighting an enemy that is among the civilian population and trying to get you, as Hamas are, to kill the civilians, it's a very impressive figure, terrible though it is. And it compares to less than 1-to-1, compares to 5-to-1 and 3-to-1 in respect to US casualty ratios in Afghanistan and Iraq. So it's a great achievement by the IDF, in my opinion. So,
Richard, you've spent quite a bit of time in Israel recently. So how is the population... what's been the psychology of the aftermath of October 7th, and is the population behind the war? I mean, James just referred to the politics of it, but what did you get from the sense of the Israeli people themselves?
Yeah, on my previous visits to Israel over the last few years, there's been deep division in Israel, as there is in most countries in the world, including, of course, Australia. Yeah. But when I arrived on the 9th of October, and I've been there pretty much ever since the 9th, I saw a completely unified country, full square behind defeating Hamas after the horrors of the 7th of October. The only divisions really that exist in Israeli society that I've detected today are, first of all, between those who think everything should be done to get the hostages out and those who think everything should be done to destroy Hamas. The two things, to an extent, are in conflict, but not entirely. I think the Israeli government has achieved pretty much the right balance in those two objectives, as far as I can see. The other division is between those who hate Prime Minister Netanyahu and those who support him. And this campaign against him has been going on for a long, long time. And I would have hoped that in this war, the anti-Netanyahu faction could have unified behind him for this conflict and then maybe take it up again afterwards. But generally speaking, I think the majority of the population are right behind the government and the war that's going on now.
And we've frequently spoken about the threat of Iran, nuclear weapons and so on. That threat has just obviously increased. What's your fears or take on where Iran is sitting now? What are the mullahs thinking?
Well, Iran, of course, is 100% behind everything that's going on now in Gaza and Israel. Hamas is an Iranian proxy, as is Islamic Jihad, the junior terrorist partner in Gaza. Hezbollah in the north, which has been attacking Israel daily since the 7th of October, is another Iranian proxy, as are various proxies all around Israel. They call it the Ring of Fire. So Iran has got its fingers on all of it. And, of course, Russia and Iran and China and Iran are closely linked, and no doubt there's Russian and Chinese hands behind this as well. But the biggest fear, I think Israel can defeat without problem all of these networks. I say without problem. There will be problems, but they can do it. The nuclear issue, which you mentioned, is the really big one. And Iran is on the cusp of developing nuclear missiles. That's not going to be stopped under President Biden. Maybe a subsequent president will do something more effective. But meanwhile, Israel's got to maintain its military and covert campaign against the Iranian nuclear program.
And finally, on that campaign and that program, what are the chances that if Netanyahu sees himself under existential threat here and under pressure from the United States, he decides to escalate this conflict further and strike directly at Iranian nuclear targets, which I know are very hardened and so on, but they've done this sort of thing before?
Yeah, I know Netanyahu quite well, and I don't think he is the kind of person who is going to lash out for his own survival. He will if he feels that Israel's survival is at stake. He will escalate against Iran if that is necessary. But meanwhile, I think he's taking a much more measured approach and working hard now to deal with Hamas, subsequently with Hezbollah, decisively, I think. And then, of course, the tension will turn on Iran.
Richard, I just quickly want to ask you, before you go, about London and what happens in the UK if Keir Starmer, which looks like happening, gets in.
Yeah. Well, the Labour Party remains Corbyn's party. It's got a different leader, it's got different kind of wallpaper around it, but it's the same party. And let's not forget, Keir Starmer was foursquare behind Corbyn when he was the leader of the party. The Labour Party have been actually remarkably strong on Israel since this war began. They've basically followed the British government line, which has been quite good. But it's for electoral purposes. Once they get into office, their tone will change. And I believe that under a Labour government, Britain will become probably Israel's worst enemy in Europe.
My God, that's terrifying. Colonel Richard Kemp, always great to chat to you. I'm sorry it's always about such serious topics, but that's the world we live in. Enjoy the rest of your time in Australia. Great to have you here.